Dr. Donald is an associate professor of geography at Queen's University, where she teaches and does research on economic geography with particular interest in local economies, regional economic development, and the creative food systems. She's published over 35 papers, chapters, and articles in journals such as Regional Studies, Economic Geography, Urban Studies, and Environment and Planning A. Dr. Donald has won many academic awards for her research, including the Governor General's Gold Medal and the Queen's Chancellor's Research Award. She has been a visiting scholar at Harvard University and is an editor of the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy, and Society. I'm also pleased to say that I've worked with Betsy in a number of projects, including the very first creative economy study for Prince Edward County done by her and her class, which really is one of the reasons why we're here today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Betsy Donald.
Thanks very much, Craig. That really was one of the most enjoyable teaching experiences I had when our class back in, I think it was 2008, did a creative food economy project for Prince Edward County. Today I'm going to talk about food, which I'm sure is the second thing you always think about in a talk. I did want to thank the previous presenter, who I thought did an excellent job outlining some of the key elements of an economy, particularly the role that collaboration plays. And that's a theme that I'm really going to focus on in this talk, because food is all about, a successful food economy is really all about collaboration and cross-pollination and marketing of place. The reason I like to study food as economic development is because everyone has to eat, and it really is the type of industry that naturally embeds itself into a local economy. It's deeply place-based, and many of us, probably some of our best memories of a place are wrapped up in the food that we eat. It can also have a detrimental effect on a community. My husband was asking me what my talk was about today last night, and I was explaining it was about the role of food and community development, and he said, "Do you remember that meal we had 20 years ago when we were on our honeymoon and we were just about to embark on a 3-week wilderness canoe trip in northern Ontario?" And I said, "I know exactly what you're talking about. It was absolutely the worst meal I'd ever had." And it was, I checked, and nobody's from that community in this conference. But the point is that I've always associated that community with bad food, even though I'm hopeful that things have turned around. Now, fortunately, 20 years later, I think that we have seen a remarkable transformation in Ontario in terms of the role that food is now playing in tourism attraction, but also in local economic development, particularly community development. On a more positive note, my husband and I had a wonderful meal in Gananoque 2 weeks ago at the opening of a place called the Pig Iron Barbecue, which is a wonderful new restaurant kind of enterprise that just started up. There's 3 family-run businesses. There's a coffee shop called the Socialist Pig, a clothing store, and this new barbecue. And what's innovative about this company, it's new, young urban entrepreneurs. They were looking for a town to invest in. They went all over Canada. They were in Quebec. They were in different parts of British Columbia. And they decided to choose Gananoque because they wanted to restore a heritage building. They've done that. They've used local contractors. They have really captured the essence of sort of an era gone by with a modern twist. And they've also, their food, they've linked with local farmers, local entrepreneurs. They also have a CSA restaurant, which I think is a really interesting idea, where people have bought memberships into the restaurant with the idea that their investment will be paid back over several years by going into the restaurant and getting discount meals. So it's a really great example of a community-run enterprise. So what I'm going to talk about today is creative food as rural economic development. First of all, just to give an update on what is creative food and how the industry has changed since Alison Blais Palmer and I started writing about it about 10 years ago. What are some of the trends? And I've done some research in the US in particular, especially looking at creative food in light of the economic slowdown that we've witnessed. Where are some success stories? I'm going to actually focus on 2 American case studies and then look at what lessons this can give to Ontario's rural communities. Okay, what is creative food? Well, 10 years ago, we used the term to describe elements of a newer food system that seemed to be fundamentally at odds with more mainstream regional economic, more mainstream agro-industrial food system. The creative food included specialty, local, organic, ethnic, and fair trade foods that seemed to have supply networks that were distinct from more traditional agro-industrial food chains. Now, their chains may have been different, but what they all seemed to have in common was trying to appeal to a quality-seeking consumer. So whether that consumer was looking for authentic food from their homeland, if they were an immigrant in Toronto, or whether it was somebody who was very much interested in local food and the role that plays in community development, or organic food, food with less synthetic ingredients. They all had these distinct networks, but that seemed to be the common element, that they were all appealing to some element of quality. That creative food is really that food that offers innovative solutions to ecological, social, and health concerns. And I've written a lot about that, the kinds of things that people were looking for 10 years ago: more nutrition, better taste, food that will reduce carbon footprint, and also that has less synthetic ingredients. We all know there's a growing health concern with growing obesity in Canadian communities. We have children now that suffer from diabetes 2 and even major health concerns. So we're always trying to think about the role that food plays in these things. So today we actually know much more about the complexity of creative food chains, and to some extent you could argue that creative food as a term may have lost meaning because we've dissected a lot of these chains and we know a lot more about them. For example, we know a lot more about the contradictions and ambiguities of systems like local and green. Bourne and Purcell have written about the local trap, the tendency of communities not to fall into the fact that local is by definition necessarily better. It's not necessarily higher quality, it's not necessarily more socially just. Another thing to think about is the role that global and fair trade systems play in the food system. I think a really wise opportunity for a lot of small rural Ontario towns would be to link up with a sister community in the global south, perhaps a fair trade community that does similar type of has a similar type of a food economy, so that there's sort of a justice and civic element to their food system as well. We also know a lot more about organic systems, how a lot of them have been mainstreamed, and also cosmopolitan food systems. There's a wonderful research that Valerie and Bruce does looking at the Asian vegetable commodity chain in New York City, where she looked at how Asian entrepreneurs in that city linked up with local farmers to get them to grow specialty products that their customers were demanding. And of course, we know much more now about regional food and the importance of regional food hubs and networks and the role of institutions and various actors along the food chain that play an important role in an entire food system. We also know a lot more about the challenges in terms of labor practices. Unlike some other industries, the food industry is a very labor-intensive industry. On the one hand, it can be low entry to barriers, which can be very good for attracting youth, but it does have retention issues associated with it. There's also a racialization component where, especially in the big cities and in the US, there tends to be a division of labor as defined by ethnicity. We also have seen a lot of challenges with hunger and food security. A lot of the creative food industry, for example, is criticized for being elitist, which in fact our research has shown it's not the case, that it really, people's interest in local food and organic food really cuts across class lines. The good news is that 10 years later, we really have much more sophisticated theoretical tools and empirical cases to draw on. One thing we don't really know yet is how are these creative food segments faring compared to the conventional industry. We don't really know how the financial crisis in the US really has affected different aspects of the food system. Many of us still talk about how it's a booming industry, it's growing really quickly, the creative food industry, but I really wanted to examine that claim because I think that we don't want to make false assumptions. What we found, though, when we looked at the US is that the industry is actually fairly resilient. It's one of the more resilient industries in the US right now. There is leveling off of organic sales and high-end specialty sales, which isn't surprising. But what there seems to be a sustained interest in is local and whole and natural food and its role in health and community well-being. Particularly when there's a recession, a lot of communities are turning to food as a way to sort of save their town, not just for its health benefit, but for its community and economic benefits as well. So we've seen a huge policy innovation now on local systems, food systems planning. And one thing we found too was that those regions with an ethos and history of sustainable food are actually faring much better than those without. So I have some statistics just to show you here, but the blue lines are recessions, and this is the US retail and food service sales between 1996 and 2011, and you can see that the industry has pretty much held its own during those recessions. This is from the specialty food product database that I ordered special runs for, and this is something that the Canadian government also looks at as an example of what's happening in Canada. They depend on this data. You can see that product innovation has dropped off, which isn't surprising. If you look at a company like Whole Foods Market, which you could argue is sort of an exemplar of, you know, the quality-based food economy, you can see that yes, its weekly sales were hit by the recession, but more recently it started to climb out of that, and you are seeing a number of stores opening up. And if you look at comparing specialty retail food sales with all food sales, you actually see that the specialty food sales are doing better overall than more general retail sales of food. And I've taken out some of the larger companies just to make sure it didn't skew the data. Organic food sales have leveled off. Sometimes you hear that this is the new booming industry, but I think you could argue that if you weren't on board 10 years ago, it's going to be harder for you to get on board. And we did see a percentage change in total loss of organic food sales in the recession. What we have found, however, is that local and place-based is really the new organic, in the sense that the whole food movement, well, existed 10 years ago. It's just picking up steam more and more. I subscribe to this Food Navigator daily news on the food industry, and basically they've talked a lot about how in some ways the whole food movement is the age of the unthinkable for processed food, is that when people are not demanding processed food, that's going to be a huge challenge for some of these larger companies. And I think about Ontario in this case. I wrote about this in an article, a paper I did a couple years ago called From Craft K to Craft C, Innovation and Creativity in Ontario's Food Economy. And if you look at the major drivers of our industry, it's still companies that produce high fructose corn syrup, which a lot of jurisdictions now have banned. So it's sort of some would suggest part of an older economy that's not where the direction is going. One thing that we've done is we've started to look at employment data in the US, and we found that places that have successful food producers and manufacturers, those foodie regions like San Francisco and the Bay Area, They already have an ethos of incorporating sustainable and fairness elements into their products and processes, and they tend to be doing better than those regions that don't have that. Another important trend I think is worth noting is the changing face of the food entrepreneur. I just was on a committee of a master's student at Carleton, Ming No, who did a very interesting ethnographic study of new urban-oriented farmers in, I think it was 10 communities, 10 rural communities in Ontario. And essentially what she found was that these new food entrepreneurs, she did farmers from both young 20-year-old farmers right up until retired people, was that they're often well-educated children of baby boomers who are really adding business acumen to the idealism of an older generation, of perhaps homesteaders or hippies that were more prone to reject society rather than embrace it. She found that these new food entrepreneurs are urban-oriented in the sense that they've recognized the challenges that our society faces right now, and they're really engaged in solving pressing societal problems like energy use, food safety, hunger, and community development, and they're bringing that to the rural communities. Another interesting thing she found was that when Peter Kenyon talked about tolerance, is that the ones that she actually lived with these food entrepreneurs, and wonderful example of theory to practice, where she lived in the communities for 2 weeks at a time and volunteered to work on their farms or volunteered in their companies, and in exchange for her getting to know what their challenges were. But she found that a lot of them were very respectful of the traditional rural ways, and that there was a sense that they were different from their more rural neighbors, but that there was incredible respect among them, and that these two could coexist side by side. And I think that's a really important point. I often hear at rural development conferences this kind of anti-urban sentiment, and I think that that has to change, because there's so much that the urban-oriented food entrepreneur can bring to a rural community, just as the rural communities have brought so much to the cities. And we see that in terms of design sensibility today, where you see a lot of barn board design in cities themselves. There's a lot of rural that has come into our urban places. So just to recap those trends then, local community development through food is not a fad. If anything, this is kind of the real issue of the day in terms of the food economy. And that those regions with a history and ethos of environmentally and socially friendly practices are faring much better than those without. And it seems that the new urban-oriented food entrepreneur is an asset. And I want to focus on two success stories. We know that there are many wonderful cases across Ontario. We know that we're going to see some tomorrow in Prince Edward County, which many people look to as an example of a community that's really rallied around food. Of course, it has a deep history, a deep agricultural tradition, but recently it's really developed itself in that way. But I wanted to look at some American case studies. First of all, the community of Hardwick, Vermont, that's really revitalized itself through food. And the second case study is more of an established foodie region, which sees a real city as a collective, an incredibly rich network of producers, writers, restaurants, farmers markets, and that's Portland, Maine. The reason I chose the US was because, and these particular case studies, is because they have similar climates to rural Ontario. They're situated in regions that have similar economic conditions. And compared to Europe, I was thinking I could give examples of like the Parmigiano region in Italy, but there isn't. I thought it would be more helpful to give examples of communities that don't have a long food history. In Canada, relative to other places, we don't have a long food history. And I think that that can be a little bit more instructive sometimes. So let's look at Hardwick, Vermont. There's a new book that's come out. I don't know if any of you have read it, but I would highly recommend it. It's called The Town That Food Saved by Ben Hewitt. He's also an excellent speaker, somebody you might want to bring to your town. Essentially, Hardwick, Vermont was an old granite industrial town that was really showing signs of aging a few years ago. The main street dotted with vacant stores. And it was even nicknamed Little Chicago for its rough edges. And it was a few years ago that the town decided to reinvent itself through actually looking into its past and looking at the role that food would play in revitalizing this community. Just want to pause for a moment and mention that a colleague of mine, Laura Cameron, who I was talking to yesterday, she's an environmental historian. And she's doing a project right now with a whole lot of researchers across Canada and internationally where they're looking at the role of archives and community development. And they choose a different theme each year. Last year was water, and this year they're doing food. So she asked me to mention this, that if any of you in your community are interested in having a grad student do some archival research on your food history, she would welcome that. And so just get in touch with me afterwards, and I could link you up with her and her team. What are some of the indicators of success of Hardwick, Vermont? Well, we've seen in the last couple of years 75 to 100 new jobs created through food. This is only a town of 3,200. We've seen new food businesses created with new institutional partners. Some of you may be aware that the University of Vermont has the Institute for Artisan Cheese, which has been a very important partner for a lot of the cheese businesses in the area. We've seen downtown revitalized through new restaurants and food stores, and also new investment dollars flowing into the community. And of course, they've had a very successful national, if not international, marketing campaign through the New York Times, CBS, and of course this book and book tour that have come out. I just wanted to take a few minutes to actually show you a video that kind of showcases some of these entrepreneurs. But first, I just want to answer the question, well, how are they doing this? What is this community doing to really revitalize itself? Well, similar to Peter Kenyon's emphasis on collectivity and collaboration, this really is a town that is working collectively as a community. Across the country, a lot of people are doing this individually, and there's many examples of that, of local CSAs and entrepreneurs, but it's rare when you see this kind of collective action that they are pursuing. The bottom line is they're providing jobs and making it possible for others to have their own business. Again, you see a lot of cross-pollinization, cross-promoting of other businesses, similar to what Peter was mentioning. They've also established a Center for an Agricultural Economy, which is located right on the main street. They're planning an industrial park for agricultural businesses, as well as a Center for Agricultural Education in the region. They've also secured the Vermont Food Venture Center, where agricultural producers can rent kitchen space and get business advice for adding value to raw ingredients. And they've already planned to assist between 15 and 20 new entrepreneurs next year. So it's a really wonderful example. And I'm just going to take you to a video that shows some of these entrepreneurs and tells you a little bit more about.
That's, in essence, is a local food system, and one which is operating today very, very appropriately in the Hardwick and the surrounding communities. My name is Monty Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for an Agricultural Economy, located in downtown Hardwick, Vermont, on Main Street, between Claire's Restaurant on one side, Buffalo Mountain Co-op on the other side. We're a nonprofit organization that's been in existence for a couple of years. We're an educational part of what's happening in the local food system in Hardwick. Our goal, our motto is really to have as many people locally growing their own food, producing their own food, then eating their own food as much as possible that is grown here, and whatever extra food that's grown, export it to markets within as close as possible, but basically the New England, New York food shed.
You know, we're building a new rural economy in this area, and we are the growth economy around here. There isn't really a lot else for industry or booming businesses. You know, you could decide to eat locally just because you want to help reinvigorate your local area. My name is Pete Johnson. I run this farm called Pete's Greens here in Craftsbury Village. It's in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, a little bit north of Hardwick. We grow a lot of baby greens.
I'll just take you to some other examples. I would urge you to watch this at some point because it's a great case study.
People want to eat, and it's really dictated by what's happening at the farm and what works for them. I am Stephen Obranovich. I'm the chef and one of the owners of Claire's Restaurant and Bar in Hardwick, Vermont. I cook for our community. The percentage of food that is grown locally that I use is anywhere from 70 to 85%. Okay, thank you. In the beginning, we had the big, great light bulb that occurred to us about doing a community-supported restaurant. 50 to 60 people provided us with cash in a lump sum that then, over 4 years, they get to redeem a dollar amount against that initial contribution that they gave us. So they're getting their money back in that form, and then they're also supporting us by coming in and dining in. And it's not, the majority of people that have the community-supported restaurant certificates are coming in more than just for that allocation, which is great, and then they're telling, 10 other people about it, so it becomes this, this never-ending cycle of goodwill.
And I'll just take you to one more.
I mean, I'm giving 7 talks in Canada next week about all of this. Like, the phone is ringing off the frickin' hook of people in communities all over the US and Canada that are hungry for this kind of inspiration, these ideas, this story.
Last summer when fuel was really high, our local co-op was spending more, it cost more to buy lettuce from California than it did to buy it locally. That had never happened before. Once that's the norm, it's like a whole new world, all this stuff. All this local production stuff is no longer a niche. It is the new economy.
And I think the reason that food and food systems are such an incredible opportunity for us to change not only climate issues, but economic issues and social issues and water quality issues is because.
So you could get a taste for that video, but it's a wonderful example of what a community is doing to try and to basically revitalize itself. So that's the first case study. The second one is more of an established food hub, which is Portland, Maine. And it has a larger population of 65,000, but it consistently ranks as one of America's best small towns for food culture. Bon Appetit magazine has ranked it consistently as one of the best places. They've been featured in the New York Times. Again, they have a wonderful kind of national, if not international, marketing campaign promoting this city as a food collective. There are just thousands of people employed in the food industry, lots of young entrepreneurs coming in. Some of the indicators of success, well, they've won a lot of national awards and accolades. They have a high ratio of local restaurants to chain outlets. They also have a high per capita number of local CSAs, community shared agriculture, and farmers markets. They have a high per capita number of food stores, shops, cookbook stores, kitchen stores, all promoting the local food system and food systems in general. A lot of the cookbook stores offer educational programs. And they also have a high per capita number of brew pubs, microbreweries, and wine bars. What made it work? Well, in Portland, Maine, they have great product. So it's not just we recognize that they have lobster there and great chowder, but they've also got locally raised lamb, fiddleheads, honey, potatoes. They've really developed a lot of wonderful products from across the food chain. They've attracted a number of talented chefs, again with this cooperative yet competitive spirit where they compete with one another, but their goal is to make Portland, Maine the best food place in America. There's a do-it-yourself attitude towards food and admiration of diverse culinary traditions. Again, echoing what Peter Kenyon said, there's an openness to new ideas, new experimentation. They've worked hard to attract new immigrants into their community who bring new culinary traditions and tastes. They've also developed, I think this is kind of interesting, a signature regional meal. So they're actually known for their breakfasts. That might be something that a small town in Ontario could do around desserts or anything. They also have lead restaurants, which I call lead cultural firms that can actually lead to spin-offs of other restaurants and food businesses. And this is really important, and I think it's something in Ontario that we need to demand more of, is they have engaged residents with high expectations, and they're very supportive of regional food. So you can have a food economy to attract tourists, which, yes, is important, but unless you have an engaged group of residents and people that live there that have high expectations and support regional food, not just high-end food, but everyday food, it's going to be very hard to make it work in your community. So what are some of the lessons for Ontario? As I mentioned, we have seen an explosion of interest in Ontario in terms of local, sustainable, and high quality and accessible food. We have companies like Beretta Meats that is no oil-based fertilizers, U Ranch. We have, the celebrated Fifth Town cheese in Prince Edward County, Lily's Cafe, the Carriage House. Stratford is a region known for its food, Niagara region. But it's certainly more needs to be done to put Ontario rural community on the map in terms of their food culture, because there isn't really that international recognition yet of Ontario and its food culture. My neighbor is quite a well-known tourist developer in Ontario, and he brings Europeans to northern Ontario for tourist opportunities. And he said, these are people that are willing to rent a Harley Davidson for $25,000 and drive into the back roads of Ontario. And they want good food. They want to have good product when they're going through these towns. So I think we need to ask ourselves, or what we could all ask ourselves in our own towns, is what is our town known for? Where does your community fit into the food equation? Do you have a strong agricultural base? Do you have good local infrastructure? Do you have cold storage facilities, canning facilities, local creameries? Do you have an abattoir? Do you have local procurement? Do your colleges and universities, or or hospitals or prisons, do they actually use local food? There's a huge potential there for public procurement and the local food system. Do you have a foodie culture? You may not have good agricultural base, but do you have any gastronomic tourism? Do you have food festivals? Who are your food champions? Do you have a chef that could take this charge, or a master baker? Look into your the women's groups that are renowned bakers in community. What about a food writer? If you don't have a food writer, what about hiring a local journalism student to start blogging and writing about your community? I've got this link here to Rural Foodies, which is a Welsh-based company that basically markets artisanal produce and promotes local products in their communities. Do you collaborate with surrounding regions? Do you market your region? So just to recap, for Ontario's rural communities, I think that we need to continue to develop infrastructure for local food products. We should be conducting sort of food IQ tests for each community in Ontario to get a sense of where they sit along the food economic development chain. I think it's important to embrace new ideas, new urban-oriented food entrepreneurs. There's huge potential to develop better collaboration with all the actors in the food chain for a place-based food vision. And of course, engage better marketing services for local producers of high quality food and drink. And I have put here some resources, and I'm happy to put this up online for people to look at. Some of the academic papers recently. Alison Blais-Palmer, many of you may know, is starting a whole regional food hub project with Dr. Chan, which should be very interesting, looking at networks and how we can create regional food hubs in Ontario. It's a wonderful paper here about the role of the downtown coffee house as providing an important third space for a community. and the role that restaurants play in reinventing rural places. There's some specific places you could check out. Organic Valley Co-op and its role in supporting the village of Lafarge in Wisconsin. New Mexico is just undertaking this fabulous dreaming vision which centers around the role of food in the New Mexico economy. You're also seeing the startup of a new journal called the Journal of Agricultural Food Systems and Community Development, which has many case studies of food and community development. There's another good case study of Woodbury County in Iowa. There's the book by Lucy Long on culinary tourism, which profiles different communities around the world. And of course, the American Planning Association now has a resource page on food systems planning and many special issues devoted to food planning. So I just wanted to thank Queen's University and two of my doctoral students, Heather Hall and Sean Field, who did some research for this project. Of course, Dr. Chan, thank you for everything that you've done for the Monessen Center, Mr. Harold Flaming, and all the farmers, food entrepreneurs, food educators, and rural communities across North America for taking the time to talk to me and for their devotion to making our food system better for everyone. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful evening enjoying some local food in Kingston.
So we have time for some questions for Dr. Dolan. Harold.
Hi, you mentioned the food IQ test. How could a rural community get something like that done?
Yeah, well, I just came up with that, and I was hoping. No, I thought you could do that. You could start with these questions, right? Then I thought you could. Where did we have that? You could start, you would actually, I think what would be good for Ontario is to work collectively. All the communities together could start comparing, like, what is our ratio of local restaurants to chain outlets? What is our per capita number of local CSAs and farmers markets? Do we have food stores? Do we have food shops, cookbook stores, kitchen stores, all these things that are indicative of a community that takes food seriously? What about your local library? Does your local library promote cookbooks and local food knowledge? I think in rural communities, there is this depth of agricultural knowledge that I don't think is ever brought to the fore, especially women bakers, women who work on the farm that have really been ignored in a lot of community development, tapping into their knowledge and getting a sense of the history of food in the region, but also perhaps a lot of these women could offer courses on canning and various things. And then looking at the number of brew pubs. I'm doing a research project with the Martin Prosperity Institute where we're developing a food quality index across North America, looking at various regions, and we have many indicators that we're using, looking also at issues of food security and hunger, which is obviously a very important part of any food shed in a community, looking at food accessibility, is there a good grocery store, and those kinds of things. So that's one way of doing it, but I'd love to chat further with you about that.
Hi, just a quick question out of interest, really. In terms of your comment about what resources or what infrastructure do you have available in your community, do you have any suggestions or strategies or even case studies of places that have dealt with, I guess, what you would call the uphill battle with policy and regulation around food? Like, for example, abattoirs. They're struggling to survive because they can't afford to implement some of the health and safety regulations that they've never had a health issue. They've never had to, I guess, make any changes because of those issues, but they're now having to implement things that no small community can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always an uphill battle, is the fact that, I mean, on the positive side, we have quite stringent health and safety laws in Canada relative to other places, which have some would argue has served us quite well. Others say that it's very reactive. We're not a proactive. Food safety is obviously a huge issue. It's relevant with the E. coli disaster in Europe. And we had the listeria outbreak in 2008. It's always on people's minds. One advantage I think local communities, local food producers have is traceability, that when there is a problem in the food chain, you can trace it back quite easily. There's more accountability, and I think that's one reason why people are moving to local food. Having said that, I think to echo what Peter Kenyon said, is positive thinking. You have to make it work. I mean, and if you look at examples of communities that have got that local creamery or got that local abattoir, it's because they've been determined, or it's been one determined person who's tried to make it work. So I think I get the feeling that there is a lot more interest at the federal level and the policy level of implementing local infrastructure. You're starting to see it now in Ontario, which is a very positive sign.
Excuse me. I come from a community that is north of the Shield, so we have about 1 inch of topsoil. But there is a group that is trying to, bring in soil and create a garden and, some hoop houses and maybe some greenhouses. Do you have some examples of places in, certainly not northern Ontario, but in the north part of Ontario?
Yeah, I think that's why when I had this. Do you have, what's your town known for? Where do you fit into the food equation, so to speak? I mean, obviously, Shield country doesn't have the farmland base, so they don't have that agricultural history, but they have the food. Everyone's still eating there. A lot of these tourist towns, they have to look at, developing northern products, which a lot of communities have. I think about Muskoka and the cranberry growers, and I think about this trend towards sort of northern foods, whether it's needles or, there are examples of that, but it is true that you have to be more creative almost. And one of the reasons too why I wanted to show these American examples is it has a similar climate. I mean, economic development theory recognizes that places in harsher climates have a much harder time on all quality of life issues because they don't have the climate to attract people. So that in some ways you have to work harder and be more creative.
Well, we have lots of moose and deer.
And there's good examples. I know at the agricultural fair in Toronto, the Royal Winter Fair, there's a new Northern Ontario booth that's really promoting a lot of those northern products, which I think is very clever.
So I just have one other question. We're going for dinner tonight. Would you have a suggestion for a restaurant in town?
Is there a Kingston? Is the mayor in the room? Yeah, there's great examples. There are great restaurants. I like Olivia. It's a nice local. It's a local a restaurant that uses a lot of local products. There's Chenoir, which is a good restaurant, and there's that one out in Gananoque that I just went to, which is pretty fun too. So I could let you know of some other ones that I enjoy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tango's a great restaurant too. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a nice place too. So I guess we'll have to go to several restaurants then tonight. Yeah, but I mean, Kingston's a good example of a region that really has a good food culture. Again, it has a very supportive regional base. But it wasn't always that way. I mean, I remember, again, 10 years ago talking to economic development people, and they were like, isn't that organic and low? Isn't that just a fad? There was this sense that why would we invest in that? So I think that there's increasing recognition that it's the way to go. And even if it's not your number one industry, it diversifies. And again, it's a very resilient part of any economic strategy.
I was wondering if there's any evidence to suggest that the communities that have undertaken a systematic approach to this, developing a local food strategy, have been more successful than those that are just sort of going organically with this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's actually sort of the next question I have for my research, because we're first of all now trying to document actual employment, jobs that have been created through local food initiatives, and then, yeah, look, and then start looking at the policies in place that have encouraged that. Because on one hand, as Peter Kenyon said, I mean, a lot of this is entrepreneurial activity. A lot of it is a lot of the great food regions of North America have been people resisting kind of traditional ways of thinking and, sort of forging a new creative identity. So I think there's a huge role for facilitation of that for communities and welcoming new ideas and new people. But again, it's probably not traditional economic development. Having said that, there are good examples of policies that have promoted good food cultures. The one that Peter Kenyon mentioned about giving tax breaks to actually get your patios going. But also there's that community in Iowa that has actually got a great resource on what they've done. Woodbury Organics, it's a whole discussion group of what they're doing in Iowa. One thing they've done is they've given tax rebates for organic conversion for farmers. And so there are things, that's a really good website to look at, sort of a discussion of what things they're doing to promote their local food economy there. And they've done a lot of local procurement as well. So again, even in your own organizations, using local food as much as you can for conferences and meetings and promoting different entrepreneurs. There's a huge role to play, as I said, in public procurement, which is so important. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah, the LCBO is kind of a unique case study because it's, a publicly owned corporation, and historically they have not been known for promoting their local products. That's changed. I mean, you can get a lot more local products in the LCBO now, and they have really changed that. But yeah, distribution is always a challenge. I mean, especially for these smaller companies, they can't guarantee the quotas that a lot of the larger companies require. So a good example is Loblaws. I mean, when we interviewed Loblaws, they said we'd love to support more local farmers. And ironically now, they are. I mean, they're really, really pushing that now. But they have to have, they have to guarantee product. So there are alternative ways of distribution around community shared agriculture and home delivery services. Kingston has a plethora of local home delivery programs. There's Desert Lake Gardens, which is working now with Alzheimer patients and people with mental health issues, as well as elderly people, to try and get food into their homes. Part of a strategy, a health home care strategy as well, to ensure that they can stay in their homes longer and also help them with good food choices. So there's a lot of more neat, different things like that, which are happening.
Thanks very much. First of all, I'd like to volunteer for any microbrewery research that you want to do.
Sounds good, I'm there.
Good. So I do a lot of work on sustainable community plans. I just want to share with everybody that almost all the plans that I've looked at include local food. So this is really going a long way towards the larger sustainability plans. But in terms of a couple of sustainability questions that I'll put forward to you, one of the things I've heard is that New Zealand lamb, for instance, has a lower lower carbon footprint than lamb produced pretty much anywhere else. So what are some of your thoughts on at times when it's okay to ship food from far away? Because the other one would be, what about in situations where you're supporting communities where you've got sustainable agriculture in place, but it's maybe in Africa or somewhere else, or there's an ethical question, or there's a fair trade, and how does that factor in? And when you're sitting in a group of people and you're trying to make decisions about when you should support local food and when you might want to support other agricultural initiatives?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There's a wonderful paper by Kevin Morgan. It's called Local and Green versus Global and Fair. And you can just Google it and it comes right up. And but it's a really it's kind of this grappling with, you know, what should we do as communities? Is it about being local and green or global and fair? And I mean, essentially, he would argue it's always about global and fair. I mean, there's over 1 billion people in the world who are hungry. You know, we can't ignore that. We, I think, have a moral responsibility as a wealthy nation to support those less fortunate than ourselves, both around the world and in our communities. So it really is both. You know, it's about strategies that support sustainable agriculture around the world. And it's an ongoing process. I mean, we're all full of contradictions ourselves, but it's the grappling with that. And it's the communities that actually recognize those contradictions and kind of grapple with them that seem to be moving ahead further on this kind of food system, promoting sustainable, because as you said, yeah, sustainability means many things to many different people, yeah. But I mentioned that idea of communities in Ontario twinning with a fair trade community in the global south, which I think would be a really neat example of how we can build those linkages. It's also a wonderful educational moment for children. There's an example in Rome where, of course, they have an incredible school meals program where they teach young children how to make pasta and eat within their food shed. But they also have the children eating bananas, fair trade bananas and chocolate from around the world. So it builds civil societies across space, which I think is also extremely important.
Okay, seeing no other questions, would you please join me again in thanking Dr. Donald? And a donation has been made on behalf of Dr. Donald to the Prince Edward County Community Foundation.